The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April 1894, just as our gardener was coaxing life back into a dying Dendrobium nobile. You see, there's something to be said about men who spend their lives among orchids. They develop a particular sort of patience, the kind that comes from understanding that beauty cannot be rushed, only encouraged. This particular man, 42 years of age and unmarked by any distinguishing features save for the permanent earth beneath his fingernails, had built his modest reputation on precisely this quality. His workshop occupied the rear portion of a narrow house on Courtmont Street in Ghent, where the smell of coal smoke mixed perpetually with the earthier scents of peat and bark. Through the glazed windows, weak northern light filtered onto his workbenches, where several dozen orchids in various states of recovery stretched their leaves toward whatever sun they could find. "Come now," he murmured to the dendrobium, though whether plants truly listened was a debate he'd long since abandoned as pointless. The telegraph boy's knock interrupted this morning ritual. 3 sharp raps, then 2 more. The universal announcement of urgent news in those days when electricity still seemed like controlled lightning to most folk. The message was brief, as such messages tended to be, each word costing good money. Cattleya mortis blooming, situation urgent, come immediately. Terms generous. Baron van Mortel, Rosenhof Estate, Bruges. Now, any orchid man worth his salt knew the legend of the Cattleya mortis. Venezuelan origin, blood-red petals spotted with black, blooming perhaps once in a decade, and then, supposedly, only before great misfortune. Superstition, naturally, but superstition with enough documented coincidences to make even rational men pause. The Baron's specimen was said to be one of only 3 in all of Europe. The gardener folded the telegram carefully, placed it in his waistcoat pocket, and considered his options. His sister Marie had written just yesterday about their mother's worsening condition. The old woman's lungs rattled like autumn leaves, and the new physician from Brussels demanded 12 francs for his modern treatments. Generous terms from a baron could mean the difference between medicine and last rites. The train to Bruges departed at noon. He packed his traveling case with the tools of his trade: brass syringes for precise watering, his German-made thermometer, vials for soil samples, and his worn copy of Reichenbach's elaborate work on orchid species, more for show than reference, as he knew most of it by heart. The modern age had brought many conveniences, but watching the countryside blur past the train window always unsettled him slightly. Fields that should take hours to cross disappeared in minutes, as if time itself had been compressed into these iron machines that shrieked and steamed their way across the landscape. A curious thing about Belgium in those years, it was racing toward the new century, while still clutching the old one's coattails. In the second-class carriage, a man read about Edison's latest electrical wonders, while his wife wore mourning dress that hadn't changed in style since Waterloo. Progress and tradition, seated side by side, neither quite comfortable with the other. The estate announced itself long before coming into view, first through the gradual improvement of the roads, then through the increasing orderliness of the hedgerows, finally through the appearance of a wall that seemed to run forever alongside the country lane. Rosenhof, when it finally revealed itself through wrought iron gates, was everything one expected from new industrial money dressed in old aristocratic clothing. The main house sprawled in that particularly Belgian manner, neither quite French in its grandeur, nor Dutch in its modesty, but something altogether its own. Jan Verhoeven met him at the servants' entrance, and here was a surprise, for Jan and he had apprenticed together 20 years ago in the municipal gardens. "Well, well," Jan said, his face weathered into deep lines, but his eyes still sharp as ever. "They've called in the miracle worker, have they?" "Hardly that. Just someone who knows when to water and when to wait." Jan's expression darkened slightly. "You'll find plenty of both needed here. The Baron's in a state, the whole household walking on eggshells. That cursed flower opened 2 days ago, and now everyone's seeing omens in their breakfast porridge." They walked through the service corridors, past kitchens where copper pots gleamed like artillery shells, and scullery maids worked with the mechanical precision of factory girls. The separation between upstairs and downstairs was absolute. 2 different worlds occupying the same space, only occasionally acknowledging each other's existence. The gardener had learned long ago to navigate between them, belonging fully to neither. The glass house stood apart from the main building, a cathedral of iron and glass that caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back in thousand-fold reflections. Even from a distance, one could feel the humid breath escaping from its ventilation panels. This was the Baron's temple, his sanctuary, his claim to something greater than mere money could buy. Baron Hendrik van Mortel stood before his prize specimen, like a general surveying a battlefield where victory had somehow transformed into defeat. At 58, he carried himself with the particular bearing of a man who'd built his fortune in Congo rubber before conscience became fashionable among the wealthy. The gardener noticed how the Baron's fingers trembled slightly as he gestured toward the flowering orchid, not from age, but from something closer to dread. And there it was, the Cattleya mortis, magnificent in its malevolence. The blood-red petals seemed to pulse in the humid air of the glass house, each black spot positioned like an accusation. The thing that struck our gardener most forcefully wasn't the flower's notorious appearance, but rather its absolute perfection. Nature rarely produced such symmetry without help. 5 years, the Baron said, his Flemish accent thickened by emotion. 5 years I've tended this specimen, and it chooses now to bloom. My daughter's wedding is in 3 weeks, on the 15th of May. The gardener circled the orchid slowly, noting the positioning of the water vessels, the angle of the shade cloth above, the temperature gauge reading 22 degrees, optimal for most Cattleyas, perhaps a touch warm for this particular species. His practiced eye catalogued dozens of details while the Baron continued his lament. My grandfather acquired it in 1839 from a Venezuelan merchant who claimed it had belonged to Bolivar himself. Nonsense, probably, but the documentation seemed authentic enough. It bloomed in 1843, just before my grandfather's bankruptcy. Again in 1870, 2 days before my father's horse threw him. Superstition has a curious way of creating its own truth. The gardener had seen it before. Orchid collectors who swore certain plants brought luck or catastrophe, as if vegetation possessed moral agency. Yet something about this situation felt deliberately orchestrated, like a stage prepared for tragedy. Tell me about the care routine, he said, keeping his voice neutral, professional. My staff follows my instructions precisely. Jan waters twice weekly, always with rainwater collected from the copper tanks. The temperature never varies more than 2 degrees. I personally check the plants each morning after breakfast. Through the glass walls, the gardener could see the main house preparing for dinner. Gas lamps were being lit in sequence, creating pools of yellow warmth against the approaching dusk. A young woman in pearl gray silk, that would be Matilda, the daughter, walked the gravel path with a gentleman in evening dress. Even from this distance, their happiness seemed fragile, provisional. The glass house itself was a marvel of organization. Each specimen had its brass nameplate, its care card tucked discreetly behind. Brazilian Miltonias hung from cork bark, their pansy-like faces turned toward the fading light. Rows of Paphiopedilums lined the lower benches, their slipper-shaped pouches collecting shadows. But everything seemed arranged to frame the Cattleya mortis, positioned dead center like an altar or a threat. "I'll need to examine the growing medium," the gardener said, producing his German thermometer. "Also the water sources, the feeding schedule, any changes in the past month." The Baron's nephew appeared in the doorway. Gerard van Mortel, 35, wearing the studied casualness that suggested anything but. "Uncle, dinner is nearly served. Surely your specialist can continue his work tomorrow?" The way he said specialist carried just enough condescension to establish hierarchy. The gardener had encountered this type before. Minor relations who orbited great houses like smaller planets, held by gravity but never quite belonging. Gerard's evening clothes were impeccable but slightly out of fashion, suggesting champagne tastes on a beer income. "Has anyone else been tending the orchids recently?" the gardener asked, directing the question to the space between both men. "Absolutely not," the Baron replied quickly. "My instructions were explicit. Only Jan and myself." Yet when the gardener lifted the orchid's pot, examining the sphagnum moss that lined it, he noticed something peculiar. The natural pattern of water absorption had been disturbed. Someone had been adding liquid from an unusual angle, probably using a narrow-spouted vessel rather than the standard watering can. He filed this observation away, his expression unchanged. Madame Celeste Rousseau entered the glass house with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades moving through others' spaces without quite claiming them. At 45, she maintained that particular French elegance that suggested Paris, even if she'd never seen it. "Monsieur le Baron, Miss Mathilde insists you join them for dinner. She worries about your health." The Baron's response revealed more than perhaps he intended. "My health will improve when that damned flower stops blooming." The gardener spent another hour after they'd gone, measuring and observing in the gathering darkness. The glass house at night was a different world. Condensation beating on glass, the rustle of leaves adjusting to temperature changes, the occasional drip of water, like a counting clock. He found the water barrels Jan had mentioned, noted their positions, the rings on the floor suggesting they'd been moved recently. Something else caught his attention. A faint crystalline residue on the rim of one barrel, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. He scraped a sample into one of his vials, then stood in the darkness, thinking. Someone had been adding something to the water. That much seemed clear. But who would benefit from forcing the Cattleya mortis to bloom? Who would want to cast a shadow over the upcoming wedding? Morning at Rosenhof arrived with the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch movement. Servants appearing at predetermined intervals, curtains drawn at exact angles, breakfast served at precisely 8 o'clock. The gardener, having spent the night in the old coach house that served as guest quarters for tradesmen, woke to observe this choreography from his window. There's something revealing about watching a great house come to life. You see the machinery behind the illusion. His accommodation was comfortable enough. Clean sheets, a ceramic wash basin, even a small coal stove that took the edge off the April chill. Through the thin walls, he could hear the stable boys beginning their day, the scrape of shovels and occasional whinny of horses. This was the honest sound of labor, unmarked by pretense. At breakfast in the servants' hall, he found himself seated between Jan and a young housemaid whose accent marked her as coming from the coal country around Charleroi. The conversation flowed around him like water around a stone. Gossip about the wedding preparations, speculation about which relations would attend, careful criticism of the menu choices. Nobody mentioned the Orchid directly, but it haunted every exchange like an uninvited guest. "Miss Matilda's been different since that flower bloomed," the housemaid ventured, then caught herself, glancing nervously at the head footman. Jan grunted into his coffee. "The young miss has plenty on her mind without plant nonsense. Wedding 3 weeks away, and that fiancé of hers coming and going like he owns the place already." This was interesting. The gardener spread butter on his black bread with studied concentration. "The young man seems eager to claim his prize," he offered neutrally. "Peter Delamont," Jan elaborated, lowering his voice. "Antwerp merchant family. New money, but plenty of it. Some say the Baron needs this marriage more than he lets on." After breakfast, the gardener requested a tour of the grounds, ostensibly to understand the water collection systems. Matilda Van Mortel herself appeared as they crossed the rose garden, accompanied by her fiancé. At 22, she possessed that particular beauty that wealth polishes but doesn't create. Clear skin, straight teeth, and carriage that suggested dancing lessons and deportment classes. But her eyes held something else, a wariness that belonged on older faces. "You must be the orchid expert Father summoned," she said, offering her hand in the modern fashion. "He speaks of little else these days." Peter Delamont stood slightly behind her, proprietary without being obvious about it. 28 years old, handlesome in that solid Flemish way, built like someone who'd played rugby at university but now confined his exercise to riding. His handshake was firm, perhaps too firm, as if grip strength could establish character. "Your father's collection is remarkable," the gardener replied. "The Cattleya mortis particularly so." Matilda's composure flickered. That horrible thing. "I begged Father to destroy it years ago." "Flowers shouldn't carry curses." "Darling," Peter intervened smoothly, "surely we're too modern for such superstitions. It's 1894, not the Dark Ages." Yet the gardener noticed how Peter's hand moved to touch the small golden cross at his watch chain, an unconscious gesture that betrayed his words. We all carry our superstitions, whether we dress them in modern clothes or ancient ones. The tour continued through the kitchen gardens, where vegetables grew in regimented rows that would have pleased a Prussian general. Here was honesty of purpose. Carrots and turnips made no claims to grandeur. Madame Rousseau appeared on one of the gravel paths, her morning dress, for a cousin, Jan had mentioned, making her look like a raven among peacocks. She walked with purpose, a leather satchel over her arm, heading toward the village gate. "Every evening, regular as clockwork," Jan muttered. "Says she's visiting the poor, but the poor don't usually require such punctuality." That evening, the gardener was invited to dine with the family, a concession to his specialized knowledge that placed him in that awkward position between servant and guest. The dining room overwhelmed with its deliberate grandeur. Crystal chandeliers from Venice, paintings of stern ancestors who seemed to disapprove of their descendants' choices, enough silver on the table to fund a small revolution. Gerard Van Mortel dominated the conversation with stories of his travels. Ostend, Paris, even London. Each anecdote carefully crafted to suggest sophistication without revealing how these journeys were funded. The Baron listened with barely concealed impatience, while Matilda pushed food around her plate like a general planning battle formations. "Tell me, Gardner," Gerard said suddenly, his tone artificially light, "do you believe plants can sense human emotions?" "I've heard some botanists make such claims." The table waited. Even the footmen seemed to pause in their service. The gardener set down his fork deliberately, considering. "I believe plants respond to changes in their environment. Whether that constitutes sensing emotions," he shrugged, allowing the ambiguity to settle like dust. "But surely," Peter interjected, "if someone were deliberately trying to make an orchid bloom, there would be scientific methods, chemicals, perhaps?" Now here was an interesting development. The gardener noticed how the Baron's knuckles whitened as he gripped his wine glass. "Indeed, temperature manipulation, controlled drought stress, certain mineral additives. The Chinese have known such techniques for centuries." Madame Rousseau excused herself before dessert, claiming a headache. Through the tall windows, the gardener later observed her crossing the grounds, that same determined walk, that same leather satchel. But this time, she paused at the glasshouse, stood there for a long moment as if listening, then continued on her way. The morning brought Dr. Ernst Müller from Brussels, arriving in a carriage that seemed to announce its own importance with every turn of its wheels. At 55, the German botanist carried himself with the particular authority of a man who'd corresponded with Darwin and never let anyone forget it. The gardener watched from the glasshouse as the Baron rushed out to greet his old friend and rival, their handshake lasting just long enough to establish equality, but not warmth. "So, the Cattleya mortis has finally shown her colors," Müller said in accented French, his voice carrying across the morning air. "I told you 3 years ago the conditions were ripening." Inside the glasshouse, Müller examined the orchid with the possessive attention of a physician with a fascinating patient. He produced a magnifying lens from his waistcoat, German-made naturally, and studied each petal as if reading a confession. The gardener stood quietly to one side, having learned long ago that experts required an audience for their expertise. "The cellular structure is perfect," Müller announced. "Too perfect, actually. In nature, such symmetry usually indicates stress response." He straightened, fixing the gardener with sharp blue eyes. "You've noticed something irregular, haven't you? Hendrik wouldn't have summoned a specialist otherwise." The gardener produced his vial containing the crystalline residue. "Found this on the water barrels. The distribution pattern suggests deliberate addition rather than natural accumulation." Miller's eyebrows rose, the highest compliment a German academic could offer. He took the vial, held it to the light, then touched a few grains to his tongue before the gardener could warn him against it. "Potassium compound, probably potassium phosphate. Harmless to humans in small doses, but for orchids—" He trailed off, his meaning clear. They spent the morning constructing a makeshift laboratory in the potting shed, using equipment borrowed from the local pharmacist and some of Müller's own traveling kit. The work was methodical, careful, titrating water samples, testing soil acidity, comparing mineral contents. Science, the gardener reflected, was really just patience dressed in Latin names. Gerard appeared around noon, dressed for riding, but clearly more interested in their activities. "Gentlemen, such industry. One would think you were searching for gold rather than plant food." "Knowledge is its own treasure," Mueller replied, without looking up from his microscope. "Though I understand some prefer more tangible rewards." The nephew's face darkened slightly. "We all have our expenses, Doctor, even men of science, I'm sure." After Gerard left, Mueller shared what he knew of the family finances. Hendrik invested heavily in Congolese rubber, made a fortune, then lost half of it when Leopold's brutalities became too public to ignore. The marriage to Delamont's shipping money would restore equilibrium. And Gerard? Debts in every casino from here to Ostend. He'd hoped to inherit before Matilda married, or so the gossip suggests. That afternoon, while Mueller and the Baron engaged in their ritualistic argument about taxonomic classifications, the gardener conducted his own investigation. He found the groundskeeping supply room where fertilizers and treatments were stored in labeled jars like an apothecary's shop. Everything was meticulously organized, John's handiwork evident in the careful inventory sheets. But there, a jar of potassium phosphate, nearly empty, though the inventory showed it should be full. The gardener made note of this, then noticed something else, a second ledger tucked behind the first, recording different quantities. Someone had been maintaining false records. The handwriting was educated, flowing, not Jan's careful block letters. A commotion from the main house interrupted his investigation. Through the window he could see Matilda in obvious distress, Peter attempting to comfort her while she pulled away. Their words didn't carry, but the body language spoke volumes, the universal pantomime of a quarrel between lovers. Later, as afternoon faded into evening, the gardener encountered Madame Rousseau returning from one of her village expeditions. Her leather satchel seemed heavier than when she'd left, and there was a peculiar satisfaction in her expression, quickly hidden when she noticed his observation. "Monsieur, you work late hours for a plant doctor," she said, her French carrying the particular precision of the educated classes. "Plants don't respect bankers' hours, madame. They bloom and die on their own schedule." She studied him for a moment. "Yes, they do. Though sometimes they need encouragement to follow their nature, don't you think?" Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of lavender and something else, something chemical, medicinal. The gardener filed this away with all the other puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together yet. That evening he received a letter from his sister Marie. Their mother's condition had worsened. The doctor was now visiting daily. The cost, 15 francs a week, might as well have been 1,500 for all he could afford it. He sat in his sparse room in the coach house, calculating and recalculating, always arriving at the same impossible sum. Through his window he could see the glass house, illuminated by moonlight, the Cattleya mortis presumably still blooming in its staged perfection. Someone in this house was orchestrating events, that much was certain. But understanding who and why, that would require more than science. It would require understanding the particular mathematics of human desperation, where need and opportunity created their own twisted logic. The decision to keep watch came naturally, the way a craftsman knows when wood is about to split before the crack appears. The gardener had learned to trust these instincts, developed over years of reading the silent language of plants and, more importantly, the louder language of those who tended them. He settled into the potting shed at 11:30, positioning himself where moonlight wouldn't betray his presence, but he could observe both the glasshouse entrance and the water barrels. Night sounds have their own vocabulary in great estates. The settling of old wood, the distant cough of a sleepless servant, the rustle of night birds hunting mice in the gardens. He'd brought strong coffee in a thermos, bitter and black as Belgian coal, and his notebook for recording observations. The scientific method, after all, required documentation. At 12 minutes past midnight, a figure emerged from the servants' entrance, not the main house, which suggested someone familiar with the estate's routines. The person moved with deliberate care, avoiding the gravel paths that would announce their presence, keeping to the grass despite the evening dew. They carried something, a dark shape that caught the moonlight occasionally, revealing the outline of a bottle or flask. The gardener remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the figure approached the water barrels. Now he could make out more details. Medium height, wearing what appeared to be a dark overcoat that obscured their shape. They produced a small funnel from their pocket, began pouring liquid into the nearest barrel with practiced efficiency. The whole operation took less than 2 minutes. As the figure turned to leave, moonlight caught their profile for just an instant. The gardener's breath caught, but then he stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, recovering quickly, but dropping something that glinted as it fell. They either didn't notice or chose not to risk retrieving it, disappearing back toward the house with the same careful steps. He waited another 20 minutes before investigating, patience being the better part of both valor and detection. The object proved to be a silver button, ornate, with an engraved design that looked like a shipping company's emblem. The kind of button that adorned expensive overcoats, the kind worn by successful merchants' sons. His mind raced through the implications, but he forced himself to continue his methodical investigation. The liquid in the barrel smelled faintly acidic, and when he tested it with litmus paper from Mueller's kit, it showed exactly what he'd suspected: a concentrated potassium solution, strong enough to force premature blooming in sensitive orchids. He took samples, made notes, recorded the exact time and circumstances. Evidence, properly collected, was worth more than accusations. Returning to his room, he found Jan Verhoeven waiting in the shadows by the coachhouse door, looking haggard. "We need to talk," the old groundskeeper said quietly, "but not here." They walked to the tool shed, far enough from the house to speak freely. Jan produced a flask of Genever, took a long pull, offered it to the gardener, who accepted gratefully. The gin burned, but it was an honest burn, unlike the deceptions fermenting in the main house. "They're trying to blame me for the orchid," Jan said without preamble. "That nephew, Gerard, he's been suggesting I've been stealing, selling fertilizer on the side. Says that's why the inventory doesn't match." The gardener showed him the second ledger he'd discovered. Jan studied it by lamplight, his face growing darker with each page. "That's not my writing." "But it's meant to look like it could be, isn't it? Someone's been planning this for weeks." "Tell me about the estate's finances, the real situation." Jan laughed bitterly. "The Baron's leveraged to his eyeballs. The rubber plantation disaster cost him almost everything. Without the Delamont marriage money, this whole place gets sold by September. Gerard knows it, Peter knows it, hell, even the scullery maids probably know it. And if the wedding doesn't happen, then Gerard stands a better chance of inheriting something worth having once the Baron drinks himself to death from shame, or—" Jan paused, considering his words. Someone else might benefit from seeming like a hero, saving the day at the last moment. A sound from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on gravel, deliberate this time, not trying to hide. Through the dirty window they could see Madame Rousseau walking past, that eternal leather satchel over her arm. But at 2 in the morning?
Even dedication to charity had its limits.
She goes to the village, Jan said quietly, but not for what she claims. There's a telegraph office there that stays open all night for the Brussels line. She's been sending messages, receiving them too. The night clerk's sweet on my niece, tells her things. The gardener absorbed this information, adding it to his growing constellation of facts. Everyone in this house seemed to be operating on their own secret frequency, pursuing private agendas while maintaining public facades. The Cattleya mortis had indeed bloomed before catastrophe, but the catastrophe was entirely human in origin, manufactured like the forced flowering itself. He thought of his mother in Ghent, probably awake now with her labored breathing, while Marie counted coins and made impossible calculations. The Baron's generous terms would solve everything, but only if he solved this puzzle without destroying the very wedding that would provide his payment. It was, he reflected, rather like trying to save an orchid by poisoning it just enough to make it stronger. The morning after brings its own clarity, harsh and unforgiving as carbolic acid. The gardener woke to find a note slipped under his door, elegant handwriting on expensive paper, requesting his presence in the rose garden at 7 o'clock. It was signed C. Rousseau, and scented faintly with that same lavender that seemed to follow the governess like a reputation. She was already waiting when he arrived, seated on a stone bench among the early roses, their blooms still closed against the morning chill. Up close, in daylight, Madame Rousseau appeared older than her 45 years, worn down by the particular exhaustion that comes from managing other people's lives while neglecting one's own. "You were watching last night," she said without preamble, "from the potting shed. I saw your shadow move when you shifted position." The gardener remained standing, letting silence do its work. He'd learned that people often filled empty spaces with truth, given enough discomfort. "You think I'm poisoning that wretched orchid," she continued, her French accent thickening with emotion. "I suppose I am suspect enough. The foreign governess, walking at odd hours, carrying mysterious packages." "The packages?" She laughed, bitter as burned coffee. "Letters, monsieur. Love letters, if you must know. To a textile merchant in Ghent who promises marriage once his wife finally succumbs to her consumption. 2 years I've been waiting, writing, hoping. The telegraph office sends my messages to preserve some thin fiction of propriety. Here was truth, raw and unflattering. The gardener recognized it by its awkward edges, the way it diminished rather than elevated the teller. Lies usually came dressed in their Sunday best. Truth often appeared in work clothes. "Show me the telegrams," he said, not unkindly. She produced them from her satchel, a bundle tied with ribbon that had seen better days. The messages were indeed romantic, desperate in that particular way of middle-aged love that knows time is running short. The gardener read enough to confirm her story, then handed them back with a slight bow that acknowledged her dignity and humiliation. "There's something else," she said, replacing the letters carefully. "Gerard Van Mortel has been asking questions about chemical suppliers in Brussels. He thinks he's being subtle, but servants talk, especially when they dislike someone." This was interesting.
The gardener sat beside her on the bench, maintaining proper distance but suggesting alliance. What kind of questions? About potassium compounds specifically, and about how one might acquire them without leaving records.
He claimed it was for a friend's mining venture, but Gerard has no friends, only creditors and fellow gamblers. From the main house came the sound of raised voices, the Baron and someone else, probably Gerard from the timbre of the responses. The argument carried across the morning air in fragments: rights of family, honor of the name, financial responsibility, the eternal refrains of declining fortune. "There's to be a family conference this afternoon," Madame Rousseau informed him. "Mathilde's been crying all morning. She's discovered something about Peter, though she won't say what. The wedding may be called off, regardless of Orchid omens." The gardener spent the remainder of the morning in investigation, but of a different sort. He visited the telegraph office himself, where a few francs loosened the clerk's professional discretion. Yes, Gerard Van Mortel had been sending wires to Ostend and Brussels. Yes, they concerned debts and urgent payments. But more interesting, Peter Delamont had been receiving messages from Antwerp about shipping schedules and something called merchandise delivery. At the local pharmacist, another revelation. Someone had indeed purchased potassium phosphate, but not recently. The last sale had been 3 months ago, to the estate itself, signed for by Jan Verhoeven on the Baron's orders. All perfectly legitimate, recorded in the poison book as required by law. But the pharmacist remembered something else. Young Mr. Delamont had been very interested in gardening chemicals, asking detailed questions about their effects on plants. Planning a conservatory of his own once married, he'd said. The family conference, observed from the garden where the gardener pretended to examine rose diseases, was a masterpiece of controlled catastrophe. Through the library's tall windows, he could see the participants arranged like players in a tableau. The Baron behind his desk, Mathilde in tears on the sofa, Peter standing with practiced concern, Gerard lounging against the mantelpiece with calculated casualness. Papers were produced, waved about, slammed on surfaces. Mathilde stood at one point, said something that made Peter step backward as if slapped. Gerard's satisfaction was visible, even from a distance. The Baron's face had turned the particular shade of red that suggested apoplexy might be imminent. By evening, the gardener had assembled his evidence like a botanist preparing specimens for classification. The silver button, the chemical samples, the false ledger, witness testimonies, observed behaviors, all pointed in a single direction. Yet something felt incomplete. The pattern was too obvious, like an orchid arranged for exhibition rather than growing naturally. He thought of his mother again, probably sleeping now under Marie's watchful care. The medicine she needed seemed both closer and further away than ever. Tomorrow he would have to make choices that would affect not just plants, but lives, futures, the complex ecosystem of a family already poisoned by suspicion and secrets. The trap, like all good traps, relied on the prey's own nature for its effectiveness. The gardener spent the early morning preparing 3 identical water barrels, each marked with an invisible substance that would transfer to skin and clothing. Different compounds from Müller's kit, each glowing distinct colors under the German doctor's ultraviolet lamp, one of his prized scientific instruments. It was, he reflected, rather like marking cards in a game where everyone was already cheating. But first came an unexpected complication. Gerard Van Mortel was gone, departed for Brussels on the dawn train according to the footman, with luggage suggesting a longer absence. The timing seemed suspicious until Jan provided clarity. Creditors were coming today. Sheriff's order. Either he paid or faced arrest. This changed the gardener's calculations entirely. If Gerard was in Brussels, verifiably so, then he couldn't have been the midnight figure. The silver button took on new significance, its shipping emblem suddenly more important than its expense. He examined it again in morning light, recognizing the anchor and crown design of Delamont Shipping Enterprises. Dr. Mueller arrived from his lodgings in the village, bringing disturbing news. I've been testing that Orchid extensively. The potassium treatment began at least 6 weeks ago, applied with precise regularity. Whoever did this understood plant chemistry at an advanced level, or had instructions from someone who did. Mueller's eyes sharpened behind his spectacles. Precisely what I was thinking. This has the hallmark of educated amateur work. Technically correct, but slightly overdone, like a student showing off to a teacher. They were interrupted by Matilda, who entered the glass house pale and determined. She'd clearly not slept, her usually perfect appearance showing cracks like crazing in porcelain. I need to speak with you, she said, addressing the gardener directly. About Pieter, about what he's been doing. The story emerged in fragments, punctuated by tears she kept trying to suppress. She'd discovered correspondence in Pieter's room, not love letters to another woman as she'd feared, but something stranger. Letters to a chemical supplier in Antwerp, discussing the experiment and ensuring dramatic results. Purchase orders for potassium compounds dating back 2 months. But why? She asked, genuinely bewildered. Why would he want to make Father's orchid bloom? He knows how superstitious Father is. Knows it would cast a shadow over everything. The gardener considered his words carefully. Truth, like strong medicine, sometimes needed to be diluted for consumption. Perhaps he wanted to seem like your protector when the threat emerged. Heroes require dragons to slay. She stared at him, understanding dawning like nausea. He wanted Father to become desperate enough to accelerate the wedding. To need the Delamont money so urgently that any concerns about character or suitability would be set aside. Or, the gardener suggested gently, to prove himself capable of handling family crises, showing your father he could manage both the business and the superstitious fears that plague old fortunes. That evening he confronted Pieter privately, choosing the glass house for its symbolic weight. The younger man arrived dressed for dinner, but early, responding to the gardener's carefully worded message about botanical irregularities requiring discussion. "You've been very clever," the gardener began without preamble, showing him the silver button. "But you made mistakes. The angle of water application, for instance. You poured from the left, suggesting right-handedness, but at an awkward height because you're taller than Jan, who normally does the watering." Peter's facade cracked slightly, then reformed. "Proving what, exactly? That I take interest in my future father-in-law's obsessions?" "Proving that you've been forcing the Cattleya mortis to bloom by adding potassium phosphate to its water. The chemical orders from Antwerp match your signature. The timing coincides with your increased visits to the estate." What happened next surprised even the gardener. Peter laughed, not with bravado but with genuine, exhausted relief. "Thank God someone knows. I've been terrified for weeks, trying to undo it without being caught." The confession poured out like water from a broken dam. Yes, he'd started the treatment, following instructions from a handbook on forced blooming he'd bought in Antwerp. The plan had been simple. Make the orchid bloom, then gradually cure it, becoming the hero who saved the wedding from superstition. But the more he'd learned about Mathilde, the more genuine his feelings had become, and the more his clever plan had transformed into a trap of his own making. "I tried to stop the treatment 3 weeks ago," he said miserably, "but the process had already begun. Orchids don't simply stop blooming because you change your mind." And then Gerard started his accusations, and Mathilde began having doubts about me for other reasons, and everything spiraled beyond control. The gardener studied him with the dispassionate interest of a scientist observing a specimen. Here was a man caught in his own web, suffering from the very cleverness he'd thought would ensure his success. It was, perhaps, its own form of justice. "The Baron must never know," Peter said desperately. "It would destroy everything, not just for me, but for Mathilde, for the estate's survival. You understand about sacrifice, don't you? About doing questionable things for necessary reasons?" The gardener thought of his mother's labored breathing, of Marie's desperate letters, of the medicine that cost more than honor could afford. Yes, he understood. But understanding and accepting were different species entirely, requiring different growing conditions. The morning mist clung to the estate grounds like doubt itself, neither fully present nor entirely absent. The gardener had asked Peter to meet him at dawn by the old greenhouse, a structure abandoned when the Baron built his modern glass palace. Here, among broken panes and rusted frames, where nature had begun reclaiming civilization's ambitions, seemed the appropriate place for decisions about truth and deception. Pieter arrived precisely on time, his usual merchant's confidence replaced by something rawer. He looked like a man who'd spent the night calculating costs he couldn't afford. "Have you decided what you'll do?" The gardener had indeed decided, though the choice had cost him his own sleep. He'd weighed justice against mercy, truth against necessity, the Baron's right to knowledge against the estate's need for survival. In the end, pragmatism had won. Not the cynical kind that excuses all sins, but the weary kind that recognizes perfection as the enemy of progress. "I'll fix your mistake," he said carefully, "but not to make you a hero. The orchid will gradually cease blooming over the next week, returning to dormancy as if naturally. No dramatic cure, no miraculous intervention. Simply a plant following its cycle, removing the shadow from your wedding. And your price?" Here was the moment that would define him. The gardener could ask for anything. Money, certainly, enough to cure 10 mothers. Position, influence, secrets to hold over a wealthy merchant family. Instead, he found himself thinking of Jan, falsely accused and bearing it in silence. 3 things. First, you'll clear Jan's name completely. Ensure everyone knows the inventory discrepancies were errors, not theft. Second, you'll pay for my mother's medical treatment, not as blackmail, but as fair compensation for specialized botanical services. Third, you'll tell Mathilde the truth, before the wedding. She deserves to know what manner of man she's marrying. Peter's face went through several transformations: relief, calculation, fear, and finally something like respect. The first 2, certainly. But telling Mathilde, that could end everything. Then perhaps it should end. A marriage built on deception is like forcing an orchid to bloom. It might look perfect, but it's fundamentally unhealthy. They stood among the ruins of the old greenhouse, two men from different worlds connected by their mutual understanding of compromise. Finally, Peter nodded. "After the orchid stops blooming. I'll tell her then, when superstition can't be confused with confession. If she still wants me after knowing, we'll build something honest. If not..." He shrugged, the gesture containing entire futures. The gardener spent the next hours preparing his treatment, not adding chemicals this time, but carefully diluting what had been added, replacing the contaminated water with clean rainwater, adjusting the temperature slightly to encourage natural dormancy. He worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, aware that too rapid a change would be as suspicious as the original manipulation. Dr. Mueller observed part of this process, his scientific curiosity warring with obvious suspicion. "Remarkable how you've diagnosed the exact treatment needed so quickly," he commented dryly. "Experience teaches patterns," the gardener replied, measuring water temperature with unnecessary precision. "This orchid shows classic signs of forced blooming. The treatment is simply reversing the process." "And young Delamont's sudden interest in helping you this morning?" "He's invested in the wedding proceeding smoothly. All of us are, in our various ways." Mueller studied him for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "You know, in Germany we have a saying, 'The wise gardener knows which weeds to pull and which to leave for the protection they offer.' I believe you understand this principle very well." That afternoon brought a bank draft from Delamont Shipping, sufficient for 3 months of medical treatment. The gardener sent it immediately to Marie via telegraph, imagining his sister's relief, his mother's improved breathing. The cost to his conscience was bearable, he decided, weighed against the cost of inaction. The Baron, meanwhile, had begun to relax as the orchid's petals showed the first signs of natural closure. "You see," he told anyone who'd listen, "I knew bringing in an expert would solve things. Science triumphs over superstition once again." But Mathilde watched the proceedings with an expression the gardener recognized. Someone assembling pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. She cornered him that evening as he adjusted the greenhouse ventilation. "Peter's different," she said simply. "Guilty about something. And you know what it is." The gardener continued his work, considering his words. "People change when approaching marriage. The weight of future responsibility affects everyone differently. That's evasion, not answer." He turned to face her directly, seeing her father's determination mixed with something more flexible, more capable of forgiveness. "Sometimes the best gift we can give someone is the opportunity to tell their own truth. Your fiancé has things to say. Whether you listen, how you respond, that will determine if your marriage blooms naturally or needs constant forcing." She absorbed this, then nodded slowly. "Like the orchid, exactly like the orchid." The Cattleya mortis began its retreat from blooming with the dignity of a duchess withdrawing from an unfortunate conversation. Each day the petals folded a bit more inward, the blood red fading to burgundy, then to the russet of autumn leaves. The gardener monitored this progress with the satisfaction of a conductor whose orchestra had finally found its rhythm after too many discordant rehearsals. On the 5th day of treatment, as May entered its 2nd week, the Baron called a celebration dinner. "The curse is lifting," he announced to the assembled household, raising his glass of Bordeaux with the relief of a man reprieved from execution. My daughter's wedding will proceed unmarred by superstition." The gardener sat at the far end of the table, in that ambiguous position reserved for valued tradesmen, neither family nor servant, but something altogether more temporary and therefore more honest. He watched as Peter and Mathilde performed their roles as happy couple, noting the small distances between them, the way their hands almost touched but didn't quite, like magnets with matching poles. Girard had returned from Brussels that morning, somehow having satisfied his creditors enough to avoid arrest. He seemed subdued, even grateful, his usual sardonic commentary replaced by something approaching sincerity. "Perhaps some good comes from this circus after all," he told the gardener privately. "My uncle's offered me management of his rubber interests, what remains of them. Actual work, imagine that." The transformation was remarkable, really. Crisis had revealed character in ways comfort never could. Even Madame Rousseau seemed lighter, her secret romance no longer quite so secret, the household's tacit acceptance granting her a dignity she'd thought lost forever. That evening the gardener found Peter in the glasshouse, staring at the now dormant orchid with the expression of a man studying his own reflection in disturbed water. "I told her," he said without preamble, "everything, the chemicals, the plan, the fear, when it all went wrong. And she threw a vase at me. Genuine Delft, probably worth more than my monthly income." He touched a small cut on his cheek, smiling ruefully. "Then she cried. Then she asked me why." The why, the gardener knew, mattered more than the what. In his experience, people could forgive actions if they understood motivations, especially motivations that included genuine feeling alongside calculation. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I started as a fortune hunter, but became a man in love. That my cleverness turned into stupidity the moment my feelings became real. That I would understand if she wanted to call off the wedding, but I hoped she wouldn't." Through the glass walls they could see Mathilde walking the garden paths with her father, their heads bent together in serious conversation. The Baron gestured emphatically. She responded with equal vigor. Democracy of a sort, the gardener thought, though limited to those with stakes in the game. "She hasn't decided yet," Peter continued. "Says she needs time to think. The wedding's in 5 days." The gardener adjusted the ventilation panels, allowing cooler night air to circulate among the orchids. Plants forced to bloom out of season sometimes produce stronger flowers when they bloom naturally. The stress teaches them resilience. Is that supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be true. Dr. Mueller departed the next morning, but not before pulling the gardener aside for a final conversation. "I know what you did," he said simply. "The gradual dilution, the temperature adjustments. Classic reversal technique. I also suspect I know why the blooming started, though I lack proof." The gardener met his gaze steadily. "Proof can be a dangerous thing. Sometimes understanding is enough." "Very Belgian of you," Mueller said with a slight smile. "In Germany, we prefer everything documented, filed, categorized. Here, you seem to accept that life resists such organization." As his carriage pulled away, he called back, "Take care of that orchid, and tell young Delamont that next time he wants to force blooming, he should use a lighter concentration." His heavy hand nearly killed the plant along with his prospects. Jan received news of his promotion to head groundskeeper that afternoon, the Baron making the announcement with appropriate ceremony. The old gardener accepted with dignity, though he caught the gardener's eye with a look that said he knew exactly what strings had been pulled on his behalf. 20 years I've worked these grounds, Jan said later, sharing a pipe with the gardener in the tool shed. Never thought I'd see advancement. Funny how near disaster sometimes rearranges things for the better. The gardener thought of his mother, probably breathing easier now with proper medicine, of Marie's relief at bills paid, of the strange mathematics by which wrongdoing had led to right outcomes. The world, he reflected, was rather like a garden. Morality was less about perfection than about tending, adjusting, finding balance between growth and pruning. A letter arrived that evening from Marie. Their mother was improving, the new treatment showing remarkable results. She might even travel to witness her son's next triumph, whenever that might be. The gardener folded the letter carefully, storing it with his other important documents, certificates of expertise, letters of recommendation, and now this evidence that compromise could indeed serve virtue. 2 months had passed since the Cattleya mortis retreated into dormancy, and July 1894 brought the gardener back to Rosenhof for Matilda's wedding celebration. The estate glowed in high summer's fullness, every hedge trimmed to mathematical precision, every rose bloom timed to perfection for this day. Jan had sent the invitation himself, his new authority as head groundskeeper evident in the improved handwriting and official estate stationery. The ceremony had taken place that morning in the village church, but the gardener arrived for the garden reception, preferring the honesty of afternoon light to the shadows of early morning rituals. He found the glass house first, drawn by professional curiosity and something deeper, the need to see how stories ended, or at least paused before continuing in new forms. The Cattleya mortis sat in its place of honor, dormant but healthy, its leaves a deep green that suggested contentment rather than threat. Around it, the Baron's collection had expanded. New specimens from Brazil, Indonesia, even Madagascar. Success, it seemed, had replaced superstition as the governing principle of the household. "It hasn't shown any sign of blooming since you left," the Baron said, appearing beside him with 2 glasses of champagne. He looked younger, somehow, the deep worry lines softened by relief and genuine happiness. "My bank account has thanked me for the peace." Through the glass walls, they could observe the wedding reception in full display. Mathilde moved through the guests in cream silk and ancestral lace, Peter at her side, their ease with each other suggesting conversations completed, truths absorbed, decisions made with full knowledge rather than blind hope. She caught the gardener's eye through the glass and raised her champagne flute in a small, private toast. "She knows," the Baron continued, following his gaze. "Peter told me everything last week. About the chemicals, his plan, your intervention." He took a long sip of champagne. "I should be furious, I suppose. The manipulation, the deception. But you're not. I'm a businessman who made his fortune in Congo rubber. I know about necessary deceptions, about doing questionable things for important reasons. At least his deception was for love, eventually. Mine was only ever for money." They stood in comfortable silence. 2 men who understood that moral absolutism was a luxury afforded mainly to those who'd never faced genuine choices. The orchids around them seemed to breathe in the humid air, each species following its own calendar, indifferent to human occasions, except as they affected temperature and watering schedules. Gerard appeared at the glasshouse door, escorting Madame Rousseau, who wore pale blue rather than her eternal black. "The happy couple requests your presence for the toast," he announced, his manner suggesting he'd found equilibrium between ambition and acceptance. The rubber trade position had suited him, apparently. Recent letters from Leopold's agents suggested he had a talent for negotiation, though hopefully of a more ethical variety than his predecessors. The garden party had that particular quality of successful celebrations where relief mingled with joy, creating something more honest than pure happiness.
The gardener accepted congratulations for his work with the orchid, maintaining the fiction that he'd simply reversed a natural anomaly rather than human interference. Several guests inquired about his services, pressing cards into his hand with the insistence of those who collected exotic plants like others collected stamps. Peter found him as evening approached, while the other guests were distracted by the string quartet that had begun playing Strauss waltzes with Belgian precision. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, his merchant's confidence tempered by genuine gratitude. "Not just for the solution, but for the lesson." Which lesson would that be? That forcing things to bloom before their time might produce flowers, but never trust. Mathilde and I have agreed. No more schemes. No more clever manipulations. "We'll build our marriage like you tend orchids, with patience and honest work. And if it fails to thrive?" Peter smiled, the expression containing hard-won wisdom. "Then at least it will fail honestly. That's something, isn't it?" As twilight descended, the gardener walked through the estate one last time, accompanied by Jan, who pointed out improvements made since his promotion. Better drainage in the rose garden, new composting systems, a small greenhouse dedicated entirely to experimental cultivation. "Your influence," Jan said simply. "You showed them that expertise matters more than tradition." The gardener thought about this as he prepared to leave, his traveling case packed with payment enough to keep his mother comfortable for a year, plus several new orchid specimens the Baron had insisted he take. His influence, perhaps, but really, he'd done nothing more than allow nature to take its course, with minor adjustments for human happiness. Standing at the estate gates, waiting for the carriage to take him to the station, he looked back at Rosenhof, glowing in the last light of a summer evening. Through the glasshouse windows he could just make out the silhouette of the Cattleya mortis, waiting in its dormancy, for the right conditions to bloom again. Not from force or fear or human manipulation, but because its time had genuinely come. The world was full of gardens, he reflected, each requiring different knowledge, different patience. Tomorrow he would return to his workshop in Ghent, to his recovering mother and grateful sister, to the steady work of coaxing beauty from reluctant nature. But tonight, he allowed himself this moment of satisfaction, knowing that in this one garden at least, the natural order had been restored, even if that restoration had required decidedly unnatural means. The orchids would bloom in their seasons. Marriages would succeed or fail on their own merits. And somewhere between truth and kindness, most people would find a way to muddle through. It was not a perfect ending, but then perfection had never been the point. The point was growth, slow and steady, and occasionally magnificent. Like an orchid that blooms not because it must, but because it can.